In the quiet woods of Concord, Massachusetts, a young man once stepped away from society's clamor and into the embrace of nature. Little did he know, this simple act would spark a spiritual awakening that would echo through generations. Henry David Thoreau's life reads like a pilgrimage into the wilderness of the soul, a holy roam in search of truth, simplicity, and the divine presence he felt in the natural world. In today's deep dive, we follow Thoreau's journey chronologically, from his early days in Concord and the Transcendentalist circle around Ralph Waldo Emerson to his 2-year experiment at Walden Pond, to trekking the wilds of Maine's Mount Katahdin, and finally to the reflections of his later years. Along the way, we'll hear Thoreau's own words, drawn from Walden, walking, the Maine woods, his journals and letters, each quote a window into his wilderness theology and the transformative moments of his life. Join us as we walk in Thoreau's footsteps, tracing how solitude in nature became his sanctuary in Scripture. We'll see how an unassuming man came to believe that a forest can be as sacred as any cathedral, and that in wilderness is the preservation of the world. This is the story of Henry David Thoreau, a seeker who found God in the rustle of pines and the ripple of a pond, and whose spiritual legacy still calls us back to nature's holy ground. Henry David Thoreau was born on July 12, 1817, in the small town of Concord, Massachusetts, a place that would shape his destiny. He grew up the son of a pencil maker in a modest, hard-working family. As a child roaming the meadows and woods of Concord, young Henry, born David Henry, he later reversed his first and middle names, developed an early intimacy with nature. He was an observant boy, more at home fishing Concord's rivers and wandering the fields than playing at schoolyard politics. His education combined formal learning with these outdoor rambles, a blend that later defined his philosophy. Thoreau excelled enough to attend Harvard College from 1833 to 1837, where he studied classics, philosophy, and science. Yet even at Harvard, he remained an independent spirit. Legend has it he found the routine there dull and refused to pay a fee for his diploma, true to his frugal principles. More importantly, college exposed Thoreau to writings that stirred his soul, ancient scriptures of India, poetry of English romantics, and the emerging transcendentalist ideas at home. Transcendentalism was a new movement brewing in New England, an intellectual and spiritual rebellion against strict Puritan orthodoxy and the growing materialism of the 19th century. Its leading voice was Ralph Waldo Emerson, the sage of Concord, who argued that true religion comes not from churches or creeds, but from personal intuition and the experience of nature as a living divine. Emerson's famous 1836 essay, Nature, declared, "In the woods, we return to reason and faith." Young Thoreau resonated deeply with these ideas. After Harvard, he met Emerson, who became a mentor and close friend, and soon Thoreau was part of Emerson's circle of transcendentalists. Emerson encouraged Henry's writing and opened his personal library to him. In 1841, Thoreau even moved into Emerson's house as a handyman and tutor, immersing himself in conversations about philosophy, spirituality, and social reform. Concord at this time was alive with discussions on how to live a higher life of the spirit. Thoreau, soft-spoken yet firm in his convictions, absorbed these influences and began to form his own distinctive outlook. In these early years, Thoreau learned an essential lesson, that truth might be found in the wild as much as in books or sermons. While society around him preached that God was to be worshipped in church on Sunday, Thoreau was beginning to sense the divine on the hillsides and riverbanks any day of the week. He later wrote in his journal, "My profession is to be always on the alert to find God in nature, to know his lurking places." This single line captures the heart of Thoreau's emerging faith. Nature was his church, and he intended to devote himself to it with almost religious devotion. By the time he reached his mid-20s, Thoreau had already tasted sorrow and insight. In 1839, he and his beloved older brother, John Thoreau Jr., took a 2-week boating trip down to Concord and the Merrimack Rivers into the wilds of New Hampshire. This journey, a blend of adventure and reflection, would later become Thoreau's first book, A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, 1849. It was partly a memorial to John, who tragically died of tetanus in 1842 after cutting himself shaving. John's death shook Henry to the core. Grieving yet determined, Thoreau poured himself into writing and nature, seeking solace along the paths they had walked together. Around this time, he also briefly left Concord to tutor on Staten Island in 1843, hoping to enter New York's literary scene. But city life didn't suit him. His heart was drawn back to Walden Pond, back to the woods of home. On July 4th, 1845, Henry David Thoreau moved into the woods. He was 27 years old, and his decision baffled some neighbors. Carrying only the essentials and an audacious idealism, Thoreau borrowed an axe and began building a one-room cabin on the shore of Walden Pond, a pretty kettle-hole lake a couple miles outside Concord. The land was owned by Emerson, who allowed his friend to conduct his grand experiment in living simply. Thoreau's goal was profound in its simplicity, to strip life to its bare essentials and see what spiritual truths might reveal themselves in the stillness. As he later explained in Walden, I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. He yearned to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life, to cut out all that was trivial so he could encounter life and God more directly. Picture Thoreau on a summer morning in 1845, standing by the half-built cabin, pine sawdust at his feet, and Walden's waters sparkling through the trees. The world he left behind, Concord's chatter, Harvard's halls, even Emerson's parlor, recedes like an echo. In its place, bird songs, the whisper of pines, his own heartbeat. Here he will test Emerson's transcendental philosophy in the field. Can a man truly find communion with the divine by living alone in nature? Thoreau intended to find out. Over the next 2 years, 2 months and 2 days, from July 1845 to September 1847, Thoreau lived at Walden Pond, keeping a journal as he observed the turning of seasons, the visitors, human and animal, that came by, and the workings of his inner self. He built his days around simple routines, hoeing beans in his small garden, fetching water from the spring, cooking his humble meals of cornmeal or rice, and spending long hours reading, writing, and wandering the woods. This simplicity was a conscious spiritual practice. Our life is frittered away by detail, Thoreau warned, urging himself and us towards simplicity, simplicity, simplicity. By limiting desires and duties to the basics, he made space for meaningful reflection and connection. Instead of 3 meals a day, if it be necessary, eat but one, he advised. Simplify, simplify. In that simplicity, Thoreau discovered a richer life of the spirit than he had ever known amid civilization's plenty. Nights in the cabin were often filled with solitude, but not loneliness. In one of his most beloved passages, Thoreau celebrates solitude as a higher companionship. I love to be alone. I never found the companion that was so companionable as solitude. He realized that being alone in nature made him feel connected to all. Surrounded by woods and water, he did not feel isolated. He felt enveloped by creation. I am no more lonely than a single mullein or dandelion in a pasture, or a bean leaf or a hummingbird, he wrote in Walden, playfully arguing that even a lake or a loon has company in itself. The divine spirit that transcendentalists spoke of seemed to whisper through every pine needle and gust on Walden's shores, reassuring Thoreau that he was part of a much larger family of life. He described dawn at the pond as a nearly religious experience. Each morning the world made anew, inviting him to live consciously. Every morning was a cheerful invitation to make my life equal simplicity, and I may say innocence, with nature herself, he noted, framing each sunrise as a chance for personal resurrection. From his modest porch, Thoreau watched Walden Pond moods through the year, from summer's clear mirror to autumn's fiery reflections of changing leaves, to the silent breeze of winter and the almost miraculous rebirth in spring. One early spring day he observed the thawing of the pond's icy banks and marveled at sand and clay flowing in curious patterns, like some primordial creation happening in real time. It was to him a hint of nature's profound cycles and the work of an artist greater than man. These moments moved Thoreau to a kind of wordless worship. In his journal, he recorded how hearing a distant owl or a honking of wild geese flying overhead in the night made his spine tingle with a sublime awareness. Nature was speaking, and he was listening with his whole being. Thoreau's time at Walden also gave him perspective on society. Living on a few dollars a year, doing occasional odd jobs like surveying, he proved that one could keep up a fire and cook victuals, and be content without the endless pursuit of wealth. When neighbors dropped by, like his dear friend and mentor Emerson, or curious farmers, or children from town, they found a Thoreau who was confident, serene, and often wryly humorous about the world they came from. He would gently challenge them. Why spend life striving for luxuries or following social conventions without question? Was not the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation, as he famously wrote, hungering for meaning while drowning in busy work? Thoreau saw his Walden experiment as an antidote to that desperation. By attuning himself to nature's rhythms, he tapped into a wellspring of creativity and spiritual clarity. It was during this Walden period in 1846 that two significant events occurred which would further crystallize Thoreau's philosophy. First, Thoreau took a brief excursion back into society, but only to venture into wilder nature. In late summer 1846, he journeyed to Maine and hiked Mount Katahdin, the tallest mountain in Maine, penetrating deep into the primeval forests of the north. Second, shortly after returning from that trip, he was arrested and jailed for a night in Concord for refusing to pay a poll tax, a principled stand he took in protest against slavery and the Mexican-American War. One experience drew him closer to the untamed nature's raw sublimity, the other to moral conscience and civil disobedience. We'll explore each in turn. But before we leave Walden, let's hear Thoreau's own reflection on why he left the woods. After 2 years, he did not simply become a hermit forever. I left the woods for as good a reason as I went there, he wrote. Perhaps it seemed to me that I had several more lives to live, and could not spare any more time for that one. Thoreau believed that there were other lessons to learn and work to do among his fellow men, and that it was time to apply what he had gathered at Walden. By 1854, he distilled his experience in the book Walden, which would become a spiritual classic. Its closing lines brim with hope and awakening. Only that day dawns to which we are awake. There is more day to dawn. The sun is but a morning star. In other words, the potential for a new, enlightened life is ever present if we open our eyes. A fitting revelation from a man who had spent his dawns and dusks in communion with nature. In early September 1846, Thoreau traded the gentle woods of Walden for the rugged wilderness of Maine. He joined a friend on a trip to the Maine North Woods, venturing into a land of dense forests, swift rivers, and towering peaks. The pinnacle of this trip was Mount Katahdin, a massive granite mountain that Thoreau longed to climb. Unlike the familiar cultivated landscapes of Concord, Katahdin represented true wilderness, largely untouched by man. The experience, which he later recounted in an essay called Katahdin, published as a chapter in the Maine Woods, was nothing short of transformative. Thoreau's ascent of Mount Katahdin was arduous. He trudged through bogs and dense spruce thickets, camped in cold rain, and scrambled up boulder fields into a cloud-covered summit. Far above the tree line, he encountered a world elemental and fierce. There were no cozy pine needle paths or kindly songbirds here, only raw rock, whipping wind, and swirling mist. Standing on Katahdin's summit, Thoreau felt a jolt of awe and disorientation. He realized he had come face to face with wild nature in its naked form, utterly indifferent to humans. In that moment, he experienced a mix of exhilaration and spiritual humbling that he struggled to put into words. His journal entry from Katahdin vibrates with this feeling of confronting the primal, This was that earth of which we have heard, made out of chaos and old night. It was matter, vast, terrific, not as Mother Earth that we have heard of. There was there felt the presence of a force not bound to be kind to man. For perhaps the first time, Thoreau truly sensed how small man is amidst creation's greatness. On Katahdin's summit, he wrote, "I stand in awe of my body. This matter to which I am bound has become so strange to me. What is this Titan that is possession of me? Talk of mysteries. Think of our life in nature, daily to be shown matter, to come in contact with it, rocks, trees, wind on our cheeks, the solid earth, the actual world, the common sense. Contact, who are we? Where are we?" That cry of contact captures the raw immediacy of the moment. Thoreau felt closer to the inscrutable power behind nature, call it God, call it the wild, than ever before. It was as if a veil was torn away, and he saw the world not as a tame garden for man's use, but as a sacred, untamed whole, of which humanity is only one small part. This epiphany would inform what scholars later call Thoreau's wilderness theology, the idea that encountering wildness brings us nearer to spiritual truth and to understanding our place in the cosmos. Descending Katahdin, Thoreau carried with him a reverence of wildness that complemented the lessons of Walden. If Walden Pond taught him simplicity and inward reflection, Katahdin taught him sublimity and outward awe. In the essay Walking, which he worked on in the 1850s and published in 1862, Thoreau famously proclaimed, "In wildness is the preservation of the world." This wasn't just a slogan for him, it was nearly a spiritual conviction. Thoreau saw wildness with a capital W as a quality that renewed life, a fountain of youth for civilization's spirit. From the forest and wilderness come the tonics and barks which brace mankind, he wrote, comparing the vigor of wild nature to medicine. He believed that every person needs a taste of the wild to be truly alive, to reconnect with our source. We need the tonic of wildness, he noted in Walden as well, to wade sometimes in marshes, to smell the whispering sedge. In Thoreau's view, a walk in an old-growth forest or an expedition to a remote lake was not a mere leisure activity. It was a sacred rite, a cleansing of the mind and a prayer of the heart. It's important to remember how radical this idea was in Thoreau's time. The mid-19th century American attitude toward wilderness was often one of conquest or fear. The frontier was to be civilized, forests turned to farms, wild beasts tamed or shot. But here was Thoreau, turning that view on its head, suggesting that wilderness held the key to preserving the world's spirit. Walking was delivered as a lecture in 1851, and to his Concord audience he explained that the west of which I speak is but another name for the wild, an eternal metaphorical frontier of the human soul. To go west in the Thoreauvian sense was to always seek the untamed, the free, the true in nature and in oneself. From Maine's woods, Thoreau also took home a sharpened sense of nature's divinity beyond human schemes. Back in Concord, when he would climb local hills or roam through Walden woods, he carried with him the memory of Katahdin's wild winds. It reinforced his belief that God, or the divine spirit, was not confined to churches or scriptures, but dwelt in the wilds, in the trackless forests, the call of the loon, the Titan presence atop a mountain. He continued to seek out such experiences, traveling 4 times to Cape Cod to walk the great beaches and dune deserts, and returning to Maine twice more in the 1850s to explore the Allagash Lakes in the Chesuncook region. Each journey was like a pilgrimage, and each time Thoreau returned with new insights and journal pages filled with vivid observations and spiritual musings. In one moving journal entry from 1851, Thoreau wrote, "I seek acquaintance with nature, to know her moods and manners. I range through the woods and fields, in all weathers, with a heart that sings." This almost rapturous approach to the outdoors earned Thoreau a reputation as something of a poet-naturalist or a mystic in his hometown. Where others saw mere woods, he saw all nature as a metaphor of the human mind. He even imagined the trees and animals as fellow pilgrims and instructors. After trekking through a lonely stretch of forest, He mused that he got what others get from church-going out of these woodland wanderings. The forest was his cathedral. The song of the wood thrush at twilight was, to him, as holy as any choir. Thoreau's spiritual philosophy did not stop at personal communion with nature. It also guided his moral and social convictions. He believed that living close to nature and listening to one's inner voice would naturally lead one to higher laws, principles of justice and truth that transcend the dictates of society. While at Walden, he devoted a chapter to higher laws, reflecting on the tug between animal instincts and spiritual aspirations, even pondering vegetarianism and personal purity. He concluded that the truly good life involved obeying the highest part of oneself, a divine inner guide, rather than just following social norms or appetites. This belief shone bright in Thoreau's act of civil disobedience. Recall that night in 1846 when he was jailed for refusing to pay the state poll tax. Thoreau had stopped paying that tax in protest of government policies he found immoral, specifically the existence of slavery, which the federal government upheld, and the war against Mexico, which he saw as an unjust land grab to expand slavery's domain. To Thoreau, conscience was a higher law than any law written in the statute books. If the government demanded complicity and injustice, he felt a person was duty-bound to break that law. His friend and fellow transcendentalist Bronson Alcott had similarly gone to jail for the tax earlier, and Thoreau followed suit. Though his stay in the jail cell was brief, his aunt promptly paid the tax against his wishes, securing his release the next day. The principle at stake was lasting. It led Thoreau to pen the seminal essay, Resistance to Civil Government, better known now as Civil Disobedience, first published in 1849. In that essay, Thoreau articulates a core tenet of his wilderness-infused spirituality applied to society, that there is a moral law as sacred as any law of nature or God, and one must adhere to it even at personal cost. He asserted, under a government which imprisons any unjustly, the true place for a just man is also a prison. This striking declaration echoed his own choice. He also wrote, I think that we should be men first and subjects afterward, meaning one's individual conscience and morality come before blind obedience to the state. This idea, rooted in Thoreau's transcendental belief in the supremacy of individual conscience, the still, small voice within, would later inspire world-changing leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. in their nonviolent struggles, a remarkable legacy for a quiet man from Concord. Thoreau's philosophy of simplicity was another way he lived by higher laws. In an age of industrial progress, he was sounding a warning that material progress could lead to spiritual bankruptcy. He watched the new railroad being built through Concord with skepticism, famously quipping, "We do not ride on the railroad, it rides upon us." To his ears, the shriek of the locomotive in the peaceful woods was a harbinger of people becoming slaves to schedules and greed. Thoreau's countercultural stance was to maintain the Spartan simplicity he had honed at Walden. This wasn't austerity for its own sake, but to free himself for nobler pursuits. Do not be too moral, you may cheat yourself out of much life, he advised a friend in a letter. Be not simply good, be good for something. He sought a life of purpose, not of mindless conformity. Throughout the 1850s, Thoreau continued to champion anti-slavery and reform causes, though never as a politician, always as a moral voice. In 1854, when the Fugitive Slave Act was capturing escaped slaves in the North, Thoreau delivered a fiery speech, Slavery in Massachusetts, declaring that any man more right than his neighbors constitutes a majority of one. And in 1859, when militant abolitionist John Brown raided Harper's Ferry, Thoreau was one of the first to publicly defend Brown. In a plea for Captain John Brown, he praised Brown's integrity and willingness to sacrifice for a higher moral law. Many in conservative Concord were shocked. Brown was widely condemned as a criminal, but Thoreau saw him as a Christ-like figure obeying a superior justice. Again, Thoreau's grounding in transcendentalist and spiritual ethics led him to bold conclusions, that there is something sacred in the human conscience that must be honored. Again, Thoreau's grounding in transcendentalist in spiritual ethics led him to bold conclusions, that there is something sacred in the human conscience that must be honored above social expediency. It's fascinating to note how Thoreau's wilderness experiences and moral philosophy intertwined. His time in nature had taught him about essence and stripping away the inessential. He applied this insight to society. Strip away the pomp and titles. What remains of a person is their character and principles. In nature, truth is evident. A pine tree or a mountain simply is what it is, no flattery or hypocrisy. Thoreau expected similarly plain-dealing truthfulness in human affairs. Thus, dishonesty in government or injustice in social systems felt to him like offenses against nature's order. To Thoreau, to live in harmony with nature also meant to live justly among others. Both were expressions of the same inner reverence for truth. He summed up his creed beautifully in a letter to a friend. I have sworn no oath. I have no designs on society or nature or God. I am simply what I am, or begin to be that. I live in the present. Thoreau sought to live authentically, guided by his own insight, formed in large part by communion with nature and solitude, and to let that be his contribution to the world. He didn't try to reform society through office or organization. He reformed it by living an example, by proving one could live free, true, and connected to the holy in nature and conscience. In Thoreau's later years, though he never again undertook an experiment as dramatic as Walden, he continued to live in concord with the same mindful simplicity. After leaving Walden Pond in 1847, he spent some time again in Emerson's household and then moved back into his parents' modest home, where he lived as a boarder with his family for the rest of his days. He maintained a small room filled with books, maps, plant specimens, and above all his journals, which he kept writing faithfully. These journals swelled to millions of words, a vast chronicle of daily observations, philosophical insights, and spiritual reflections. Thoreau walked miles every afternoon, in all seasons, often returning with his hat full of huckleberries or botanizing along the way. Neighbors grew used to the sight of Henry striding across a frozen river or laying on his stomach to examine wildflowers. They affectionately nicknamed him the woodchuck or the hermit, not always understanding his purpose, but respecting his integrity. Though outwardly quiet, Thoreau's influence was growing. In 1854, his masterpiece Walden was published, and while it only sold modestly at first, it earned him a reputation as an important American writer and thinker. He gave lectures occasionally, including one of the succession of forest trees, an ecological insight into how forests regenerate, that was widely praised. In fact, Thoreau's keen observations of nature made him a forerunner of ecologists. He noticed subtle patterns like how pine seeds travel or how the woods recover after a fire. His late essay, Autumnal Tints, celebrated the spiritual message of fall leaves, returning to the soil, seeing in it a cycle of death and rebirth that gave him a comfort about mortality. Unbeknownst to many, Thoreau's faith in nature was also a faith in eternity and renewal. He saw every part of creation as connected, with death simply making way for new life. Thoreau never married and had no children. He had close friendships, especially with the Emerson family, the Alcotts, and a few others, but largely he kept his own company. Biographers sometimes paint him as a loner, but in truth, Thoreau was deeply connected to his family. He was devoted son and uncle. To his community, he was often helping neighbors survey land or lending books, and above all to nature. In a sense, the forests, ponds, and fields of Concord were his family. In a late autumn journal, he wrote tenderly of the trees as if they were wise elders, and the returning birds of spring as cherished friends. This perspective, that all beings are part of one great family of nature, is a hallmark of Thoreau's spiritual vision. It's an idea that resonates now with environmental ethics and the notion of the interconnected web of life. In 1859, Thoreau's beloved older sister Helen died, and his father, John Thoreau Sr., passed away as well. Thoreau took over more of the family pencil business to help out, yet he never gave up his true calling, observing and writing about the natural world and urging others to live conscientiously. By 1860, however, Thoreau's own health was failing. He had suffered from tuberculosis on and off since his college days. A late-season camping trip in cold, wet weather, counting tree rings, ever the curious naturalist, weakened him severely with bronchitis. Consumption set in, and he grew frail. In 1861, friends took him on a final journey to Minnesota, hoping the change of air might heal him. Thoreau enjoyed the wide prairies and rivers there, but the improvement was temporary. He returned home to Concord for the last time. In the spring of 1862, as the Civil War began to tear the country apart, a war Thoreau had long foreseen would be inevitable to purge the evil of slavery, Thoreau lay dying. Emerson, ever the friend, visited him often in those last months. It's said that one afternoon Emerson asked if Henry had made peace with God. With dry Yankee wit, Thoreau replied, "I did not know we had quarreled." In that gentle quip lies something profound. Thoreau felt he had been at peace with God all along, for he had walked hand in hand with nature and conscience. On May 6, 1862, Henry David Thoreau passed away at only 44 years old. He was buried on Arthur's Ridge in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Concord, not far from Emerson, Hawthorne, and the Alcotts, under a simple tombstone that reads, Henry. Thoreau's earthly journey was complete, but in many ways his spiritual journey continues in us who read his works and walk his paths. After his death, Thoreau's friends published more of his works. The Maine Woods in 1864, Cape Cod 1865, his collected letters and journals, and essays like Walking. As the decades passed, Walden gained a wide readership, especially inspiring those seeking alternatives to modern hustle. Mahatma Gandhi reportedly read Thoreau's Civil Disobedience in Walden and drew courage to resist the British Empire without violence. Dr. King cited Thoreau's principle that it is just to break unjust laws. Environmentalists in the 20th and 21st centuries hold Thoreau as a patron saint of conservation. His idea that nature is holy ground helped seed the movement to establish national parks and preserve wild lands. Every time someone says keep it wild, Thoreau's legacy smiles. In Concord today, Walden Pond is a shrine of sorts. Visitors from around the world hike to the side of Thoreau's cabin, marked by cairns and cornerstones, and pause to reflect by the water's edge. The air still carries the pine scent that Thoreau knew, and if you sit quietly at sunset, you might hear a loon call or see the evening star reflected in the pond. In those moments, Thoreau's words come alive. Heaven is under our feet as well as over our heads. Nature's dual citizenship, earth and heaven as one, is perhaps Thoreau's greatest sermon. Before we close, let's recap the essence of Thoreau's wilderness theology that we've traced in this journey. Divinity in nature. Thoreau believed, and showed by example, that one can experience the divine directly through nature. The woods, the pond, the mountain, these were sacraments to him, outward signs of an inner truth. My profession is to be always on the alert to find God in nature, he wrote, and indeed he acted like a devoted pastor of the wild, attuned to every sermon the birds and the brooks offered. Simplicity and deliberate living. By simplifying life, as he did at Walden, Thoreau cleared the noise that often drowns out the voice of the Spirit. Living deliberately meant living with purpose and mindfulness, which for him opened the door to spiritual insight and joy in every task. Chopping wood, planting beans, watching the sunrise, these became sacred activities when done with a conscious heart. Solitude and the inner voice. Thoreau's solitude was not emptiness, but fullness. In solitude he found companionship in his own soul and with the sublime around him. He discovered that when we are alone in nature, we are never truly alone. We are with the entirety of existence. This solitude empowered him to trust his inner voice of conscience, leading to his courageous stands like civil disobedience. Wildness and spiritual renewal. Thoreau's trek in Katahdin and his essay Walking teach that wildness is not something to fear, but something to revere. It reconnects us to our primal selves and to the creation beyond our making. In wildness is the preservation of the world, he said, a prophetic statement now seen as a cornerstone of environmental spirituality. Wilderness has a saving power. It reminds us of truth larger than our brief lives, giving us perspective and humility, but also inspiration. Higher laws and moral clarity. Finally, Thoreau integrated his spirituality with his ethics. The purity he sought in the woods translated to purity of principle. He taught that one must stand up for justice, even if alone, a majority of one. To live in harmony with nature's God meant to oppose what was against love and truth amongst humans. This unity of ecology and ethics, seeing the connection between how we treat the land and how we treat each other, makes Thoreau a man ahead of his time. As we conclude this holy Rome with Thoreau, imagine one last scene. It's dawn at Walden Pond, sometime in 1847. Thoreau steps out of his cabin as the sky just begins to lighten. The mist clings to the glassy surface of the water. In the stillness, he feels a oneness with all around him. The chickadee stirring in the brush, the chill of the dew, the very rays of light peeking over the trees. He breathes in and feels the presence of the morning as something holy. Then the sun's disk breaks the horizon, flooding the world with gold. Thoreau closes his eyes and faces its warmth. At this moment, he is fully awake, alive to the miracle of existence. He would later write, "Only that day dawns to which we are awake. There is more day to dawn. The sun is but a morning star." Henry David Thoreau spent his too brief life awake to the dawn of every day, and he has shown us how we might do the same. The morning star still beckons. The wild within and around us still whispers divine truths. It's up to us to listen, deliberately, reverently, and with the simplicity of an open heart. Thank you for listening to this episode of Holy Rome. Until next time, remember Thoreau's gentle reminder: live in each season as it passes, breathe the air, drink the drink, taste the fruit, and resign yourself to the influence of the earth. In that surrender, we too may find our holy ground.